Ted Cruz's campaign against Nigeria. What's your how do you see this? What's your view on it?
Well, so eh, I guess the most useful way to understand what is going on for, I guess, a geopolitical beginner is to examine what Ted Cruz has said about places around the world where the exact thing he claims is happening in Nigeria are
Hmm.
actually happening.
Hmm.
So, for example, what has Ted Cruz said about what is going on in Gaza, for example? And that gives you a very useful window into what is not being said as against what is being said. And what is not being said is that clearly the issue here is not whether there is persecution taking place against a certain group of people or not. It's not whether there are killings targeting a certain group disproportionately or not. That is actually not the issue that the Americans are concerned with. The issue they are, in fact, concerned with is their geopolitical interests. So, depending on where those interests lie, it might be expedient to them to play up a certain narrative, whether real or imagined. In
Hmm.
this case, there is definitely an element of truth to it. I myself have covered some of these stories in the past. However, that is not to say that what Ted Cruz is saying is actually, in fact, true. Because there are several ways to tell lies. One of the ways you can tell lies is to lie by omission. And what he is not saying, for example, is that yes, in parts of the Middle Belt and the north of Nigeria, Christians, and this is backed up by data, by the way, Christians do die, and they do so in some cases disproportionately as compared to other populations. However, Christians are not the only ones dying, and they're not the only ones targeted in these places. What he's intentionally not mentioning is that the key thing that all these places affected by this violence in Nigeria happen to have in common
Right.
is that these are all areas which are rich in the very exact resources that the United States government is after, specifically rare earth mineral resources. At a point when over 70% of rare earths are controlled by China, and as you know, there's a trade war going on between the US and China, and the US is trying to secure as much of these rare earth minerals as possible for the sake of its future economic and shooting war with China, which is going to happen. It only makes sense that any area which is rich in those resources and
Hmm.
which the US government considers to be ruled by a weak government,
Hmm.
you're going to start hearing these narratives about them. This has happened multiple times before. I mean, we're all old enough here to remember when there was a time when this exact campaign was rolled out regarding Iraq and Saddam Hussein, that Saddam Hussein supposedly had weapons of mass destruction. Iraq was going to destroy the world.
Hmm.
And in order to save the world from the threat of this horrible dictator in Baghdad, then the US and NATO had to combine their military strength and roll into Iraq and basically neutralize Saddam Hussein. And obviously, as we found out at leisure, this whole narrative was constructed on a fiction.
Hmm.
There were no weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein was not a threat to anyone in any way. And the actual objective of going into Iraq was not to fight terrorism or to neutralize any weapons of mass destruction. The actual goal of
Hmm.
invading Iraq was to seize resources. That is what it has always been about. That is what it will always be about. So, for those who, I guess, don't aren't really tapped into how the world works and the rules on which the geopolitical world operates, that's what they need to understand. That when you see characters like Ted Cruz making these statements, right, these sort of dyed in the wool neoconservative, members of the American establishment, these war hawks making these noises. When you see people like Eric Prince, for example, who is the CEO of the founder of the now disgraced Blackwater mercenary group,
Hmm.
a mercenary group that whose behavior was so criminal that it was actually prosecuted by the U.S. government. When you see people like that, then coming out in public and saying that they would like to lead military expeditions
Hmm.
into Nigeria, supposedly to save Christians, then you really need to ask yourself, what is the objective here? Is the objective for a group of white Americans to save a group of black African Christians whom they didn't know existed last week? Or what could be in service to their geopolitical goals that these populations have that they want. That's a more useful way of examining it. And once you see the world through those lens, it's easier to sort of see through the noise and not get lost in the narratives that people try to construct. Because I can assure you that there's no member of the US establishment, be it a conservative, be it a liberal, be it a war hawk, be it a dove, whatever it is, that has any interest in protecting any group or any subset of Nigerians from another subset of Nigerians or Africans. As far as those people are concerned, we are all one single thing. We're all a monolith. So the idea that whether Christians are in fact being targeted with violence or not, that somehow is a problem for the US government to fix. Anybody who holds that idea in their head in this part of the world needs to wash their head with soap, needs to get that idea out of their head. That's a dangerous idea. That's a destructive idea. There's lots of historical precedent, including very recent precedent. You remember Nigeria is basically 2 borders away from like the world's biggest example of why US military intervention in your country is a very terrible idea, right? Libya, this wasn't that long ago. So coming from the neighborhood that we come from and having lived through the experiences, very recent experiences that we have lived through, we should know better.
But we still need to unpack a few things. A few weeks ago, the vice president of Nigeria was at the UNGA 80, and I made the position of the country known. Soon afterwards, we started hearing all of these things. I heard what you said about resource and access and all of those things, which is also a factor. But my question is, why are all of these coming right after the vice president's speech? Is there a connection to it, or this is purely based on rare earth minerals and resource, Nigeria's local resource?
So it's a bit of both. There's a bit of, I guess, what you would call political opportunism. So it would be that, first of all, if you recall, the vice president's speech came, I believe, the day after or 2 days after an official UN report designated what was happening in Gaza as a genocide.
That's right.
So basically, at that point, at the point we're in now, the official verdict of history is that the US and its vassal states in the Middle East are in fact committing a genocide against an indigenous population. So at that exact moment, there needed to be something to change the narrative, to deflect at that point. So it was a very convenient thing to bring up that, well, even if a genocide is being committed in Gaza against a majority Muslim population, well, think about this other country, a few thousand kilometers to the west of Gaza, a country that most of you cannot find on the map and which you probably didn't know existed last week. And let's start talking about this other thing, right? So that we can stop talking about this. It's a tactic of bad faith argument, which is called the whataboutism, right? So I know there's a genocide, an officially, legally recognized genocide going on in Gaza, a genocide that has been recognized by the ICC, the ICJ, and the UN as a genocide. That is happening. But instead of talking about that, what about this other thing, which we will then tenuously call a genocide, even though there actually hasn't been any legal proclamation by any of these institutions designating it as such. So there's this 9 out of 10 here. But instead of talking about the 9 out of 10, let's look at this tenuous 3 or 4 out of 10. And somehow that's supposed to take attention away from the obvious 9 out of 10. So that's I guess the opportunism that you're referring to. And what I need Nigerian Christians in particular to understand is that the fact of your religious faith, your religious identity, your religious belief is, in the eyes of those who run global geopolitics, is nothing more than a calculation on a chessboard.
It's nothing more than a strategy, a calculation, a chess move or something. That's what it is to them.
Nobody actually cares whether you're a Christian or you're Muslim or you worship a Shigidi, you are atheist, whatever it is. It's actually not important in the geopolitical calculation of the world. What is important is, first of all, what resources are present where you are. How can you and the resources under your feet be useful to those who consider themselves to be the countries that actually matter? That is the calculation that is being made. So the fact of you being Christian or you being Muslim or you being Igbo or being Hausa or being Yoruba, whatever you are, the world outside doesn't really care about these things. These things are only useful for the purpose of dividing you strategically so that some sort of geopolitical or military objective can be reached. And by the way, we have a very, very long history of having these exact games being practiced on us and having these tactics used successfully against us. So the very last group of people in the world, in my opinion, who should be falling for this is Africans. We have 500 years of recent history showing us that these geopolitical actors from the global north don't actually see us as anything other than just one black monolith. That's what they see us as, right? So the other sub-identity layers that we have historically have only ever been useful to them for the purpose of strategic division. So, this one is classified as Igbo, which is an ethnic identity that really didn't exist 200 or 300 years ago. This one is classified as Yoruba, which is another sort of ethnic panoply which didn't exist 200 or 300 years ago. And then you are pitted against each other. Someone knocks your head together so that the things under your feet, which are the real prize, you continue hemorrhaging those things while you're focused on fighting this non-existent fight, this baseless fight against each other. And it's the same strategy being deployed again here, that someone is coming out to tell you that, hey, this violence happening in your country, that instead of you to see it as a national problem for you to fix using your sovereign instruments of state, instead of you seeing it as a problem of state capacity, which is fundamentally what it is, because when you have these non-state actors that have the capacity to overrun your state actors, your security agencies, that's what it is. Your sovereignty is being violated. And instead of you seeing it as that, you rather start seeing it as a religious quarrel, an ethnic dispute. And then you start being receptive to the idea of an outsider coming in to further violate that sovereignty, which is already being violated, and somehow that's supposed to be the solution. So currently, your problem is at an amplitude of 5 out of 10. And what is being presented to you as a solution is something which is going to bring it up to an amplitude of 9.8 out of 10. It's going to worsen your situation. It's not going to solve your problem at all. So I really do wish that people would analyze this more dispassionately and stop sort of letting that immediate rush of emotion, because your religious identity has been mentioned, dictate their reaction. Because I promise you, this has nothing to do with your religion. This has nothing to do with your ethnicity or your tribe or whatever. And this has everything to do with the things under your feet, because the global north places more value on the things under your feet than on the people who are walking on top of those things. Global north sees value in the minerals that are buried in African soil, but not the people who are walking above those minerals. And it's very important that we understand that.
David, why this